Talk about cases very much.
Really?
Yeah. Especially certain areas like
Good afternoon. Just for the record, I am not Jessie Hill, who's on the schedule to moderate. Unfortunately, Jessie couldn't be here, and so I don't move very fast, so the editors have entrapped me into additional duty. We're going to move on to our second panel. This is sort of the social scientist panel, although not completely, on the real impact of redistricting on elections. Let me just quickly introduce our speakers, and then we'll go in turn. To my immediate right is Justin Buchler, who is my political science colleague. Justin has done a lot of work on representation and elections. Justin has a new book that has appeared recently, Hiring and Firing Public Officials.
Rethinking the Purpose of Elections.
Right. If you're looking for a good stocking stuffer for the holidays.
Great for all ages.
Right, okay. Next to him is Mark Salling from the Levin College of Urban Affairs at Cleveland State University. Mark is a demographer and our geographer and the director of the Northern Ohio Data and Information Services. Next to him is Tom Brunell, who is a professor of political science and senior associate dean of graduate education at the University of Texas at Dallas, who has done work on representation. John Griffin, associate professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame, who's done some work, done a lot of good work on Congress. And at the end of the table, Michael Kang is actually also a political scientist, but he's a law professor. He's associate dean of faculty and professor of law at Emory University. And with that, let me turn things over to Justin.
All right, so as John said, I'm a political scientist, not a lawyer, so when I think about a case like Baker v. Carr and the consequences, I'm much more interested in the political consequences. And as John said, I'm particularly interested in representation. Now, there are a lot of different meanings to the word representation. In my research, I've been concerned primarily with partisan and ideological representation. So when I think about things like Baker v. Carr, I'm concerned with how that has affected partisan and ideological representation in Congress. So if we want to think about partisan representation and what the equal population standard has done to partisan representation, let's talk about how redistricting can work in a system without an equal population requirement for districts. So hypothetically, let's say you're drawing district lines and you don't have any formal legal constraints whatsoever. You can do whatever you want. So if you're really interested in taking the maximum amount of advantage in this particular type of system, what would you do? Well, if you had perfect data and unlimited chutzpah, essentially what you would do is take every single voter who belongs to the other party, cram them all into one overpopulated district that makes Elbridge Gerry's salamander look like the state of Wyoming, and then carve up everybody else so that you give yourself 100% majority in every other district in the state. Stable majority in every district but one. Great, right? So what happens when we apply an equal population standard to redistricting? Suddenly, there is a constraint on your partisan ambition. And that's really what I'm going to talk about today, is the kind of constraint that equal population puts on partisan ambition. So the way that it puts a constraint on partisan ambition is if you're going to try to take partisan advantage of controlling the redistricting process with equal population, you have to be willing to absorb a certain amount of risk. And the more advantage you try to take, the more risk that you run. So in a system with equal population, if you want to take partisan advantage, what you do is the old strategy that we know and love, the pack and crack strategy. So when you're doing the pack and crack strategy, essentially what you're doing is you're taking all the people that you're trying to screw, you stick them into a small number of districts where they are an inefficient supermajority, and then for the rest of the districts, you give yourself a more narrow majority. That's how you take partisan advantage of the process. Now, the problem with doing that is if you have a narrow majority, a slight shift in population preferences, and you lose a lot of seats. This happens once in a while, and when it happens, we have a name for this that Tom Brunell and Bernie Groffman, they call this a dummy mander when one of these plans backfires. So I have a relatively simple question. How far can you push your partisan advantage when you have an equal population requirement without running into a dummy mander? How much can you get away with? How much does this equal population standard constrain partisan ambition? That's my question. So I'm going to start talking about this in some relatively simple mathematical terms. So the first thing I want to do is I want to talk about how do we assess the risk of a partisan redistricting plan. So if we're going to assess the risk, we need to know a couple of things. So a couple of factors to keep in mind. So we're going to do this mathematically. So I need to know a couple of things. The first thing I need to know is the number of districts in the state. Next thing I need to know is the proportion of the state's population belonging to the disadvantaged party, the people who are going to get screwed. Then the next thing, the number of districts that you're going to pack. So P is going to be some number less than N. And then E, efficiency. This is the quirk. So efficiency is going to be a number between 0 and 1 that represents how efficiently you can pack the disadvantaged party voters into their district. So what you would really like to do is have an efficiency of 1. What that would mean is that in a packed district, every single voter belongs to the disadvantaged party. That's how you take maximum advantage. The higher the efficiency of your packing system, the more partisan advantage you can take. So using a couple of simple factors then, we can just calculate a few things. So the proportion of the state population consisting of disadvantaged party voters residing outside the district, outside of the packed districts, D minus EP over N. A couple more formulas. So proportion of the state population residing outside packed district, N minus P over N. And then we get down to this thing at the bottom here. So this formula down here is the really critical thing. I'm not sure how well you can read that. 1 minus D minus EP over N minus P over N. So what this tells us is if you are packing a state with N districts, you're going to pack P districts with efficiency E, disadvantaged party, their proportion of the population is D. What this thing tells us is the advantaged party's majority in all of the unpacked districts. So the easiest way to look at this is, all right, so we're going to try to move. Okay, this is a little bit better. So let's look at a hypothetical state with 20 districts, which is a little bit bigger than Ohio, but 20 is a nice round number. So let's say hypothetically you can pack people's districts with 100% efficiency. The way to read this table is hypothetically, let's say the majority party has a 53-47 advantage. So we're in this row here. So the minority party has 47% of the population. So if you take one district and pack that district with perfect efficiency with voters of that disadvantaged party, then in the remaining 19 districts, the advantaged party has 56% of the vote, not 53. Pack 2 districts, and in the remaining districts, you have 59% of the vote. So in the 18 remaining districts, the advantaged party has 59% instead of 53%, and so on. So these numbers give us an estimate of how big your advantage will be given the number of districts that you pack. And of course, the more districts you pack, the safer your majority is in the unpacked districts, but the fewer seats you're likely to win. So this is starting to get us at how we assess the risk of a partisan redistricting system. The problem with these numbers is these are based on the efficiency of 100%. You cannot pack districts with perfect efficiency. It can't be done. So what happens when we look at a slightly more realistic level of packing? So what happens if we can pack districts with 75% efficiency? So coming back to this 47%. So let's say we're looking at a 53-47 advantage for the majority party. Pack one district with 75% efficiency, and in the remaining 19 districts, you have 54% of the vote. If you pack, let's say, 4 districts with 75% efficiency, then you're up to 60% of the vote in the remaining 16. So that's a lot safer. So the important point here is what these tables are telling us is how many districts do you have to pack in order to achieve a certain level of majority in the districts that you're trying to create for yourself. The problem is what we don't have yet is an estimate of how safe is 60%. Is 60% safe? Well, it's relatively safe. It's safer than 53%, but you still might lose. So the next question is how much of an advantage do you need to be really, truly safe? Now, we can do this in a couple of ways. One way is with statistical theory, but let's not bother with that. Let's just look at some actual data. So what I'm going to do next, is I'm going to talk about the likelihood of winning a district, a U.S. House district, for every election after a redistricting plan is implemented when you have a certain level of advantage in that first redistricting system. So what I'm going to do is look at how many times you win when you have a certain level of advantage. And this means looking at districts where you have a narrow advantage. Now, a lot of people are under the impression that we don't actually have a lot of close districts to look at. We actually do. So just a few simple things. Proportion of districts that are competitive has not really declined over time. Simple little graph. Looking at the 1992 redistricting plan, plenty of close districts. Looking at the post-2000 plan, plenty of close districts. So we have plenty of data to look at. So let's start with the 1990s plan. So this first table here, or next table here, probability of Democratic victory by Bill Clinton's 1992 share of the two-party vote. So if we look in this first row, so if we look at the districts where Bill Clinton got between 50 and 55% of the vote in 1992, let's look at how often Democrats won in those districts in each of the subsequent elections. Well, in 1992, they won those districts 63% of the time. But 1994 was a big year for Republicans. So in 1994, the Democrats only won 44% of those districts. 47%, 96, 46%, 46%, for an average of 49% in the 1990s. So theoretically, Democrats had an advantage in those districts, but they didn't actually do all that well because it was too narrow and opinions shifted. That's what happens if you have a narrow majority. You run the risk of that happening. Now, if we come down to the places where you have 65% or more, Democrats won those districts, period. Every once in a while, there's a weird thing that will happen. But if you're at 65% of the vote or higher in terms of the presidential vote, you're going to win those districts pretty much throughout the decade. So once you're at that 65% mark, you're pretty much safe. So Republicans, in the 1990s, we have a similar pattern. So where Bush got between 50 and 55% of the vote in 1992, Republicans usually won those seats, but they ran some risks, particularly in 92. 65% and above, pretty safe. So let's look at the 2000s. So these are districts. These are, so 2002 versus 2000 vote share. So the presidential vote had to be recalculated with the new set of districts. Luckily, Gary Jacobson is very kind and does all of this for anybody who wants to see the data. So we see the same basic pattern. If you have a 50 to 55% of the vote advantage in the first year, you're probably going to win, but you run serious risks. Once you're at 65% or above in that first year, you're safe pretty much throughout the decade. So that's the basic pattern we're seeing. So what this is telling us is if you're trying to figure out how much of a partisan advantage you can take of controlling the redistricting process, what you really want to do is try to make sure you get to something around that 65% threshold. Because once you get to that 65% threshold, you're pretty darn safe. If you're giving yourself majorities that are more narrow than that, you run some serious risks. So the question then is, how many districts do you have to pack in order to get to that 65% threshold? So let's come back to a table I put up a little while ago on efficiency of packing. So let's go with the more realistic 75% packing instead of 100% packing and try to figure out how many districts you have to pack. So let's look, for example, at this 45%. So let's say you have 55-45 in the state. If you want to get to 65% in the districts that you're not packing, how many districts do you have to pack? You have to pack 5 districts. So the 65% figure here. So what this means is if the majority party has a 55-45 advantage and they can pack the disadvantaged party's districts with 75% efficiency, then they have to pack 5 districts in order to give themselves 65% or more in the remaining 15. So think about what that means. So if you have a 55-45 advantage, but you can win 3/4 of the districts, that's a 20-point gap in terms of representation. That's actually pretty big if you think about it. And one of the things that's interesting about that number is we generally don't see representational gaps that big. Every once in a while we do, but we frequently see gaps that are much smaller. So if we put up what's been happening in Ohio, I'm almost done. So if we put up what's been happening in Ohio for the last couple of decades, let's look at the proportion of seats Democrats have won in Ohio in these elections. Now notice what happens in 2010. So 2010 was a big year for Republicans. Democrats won 28% of House districts in Ohio in 2010. And one of the things that has happened in redistricting in Ohio this year is, so Ohio is losing 2 seats. And what's happening is Republicans are essentially trying to consolidate the gains that they made in 2010. Which means that what's happening here is the party controlling the redistricting process is actually attempting to give itself as large and efficient and stable a majority as it can, which is actually larger and more efficient and more stable than what we usually see in redistricting plans. So this leads to a couple of obvious questions. Question one is, will they succeed? So I've given some theoretical reasons to think that this type of plan can be successful. You can give yourself that big of a representational advantage with equal population simply by managing your risk appropriately. But the other obvious question is, why don't people take more advantage of controlling the redistricting process? One of the things that these numbers suggest is that parties that control the redistricting process actually probably could take more advantage without running a risk if they really tried. Why aren't they? I don't know, but it's an interesting question. So.
That's a hard act to follow, but I'm going to try. Let's see. Oh, where am I? That's right there. And to get it started, you and show. How do I show? Start the slide. Slideshow. Good. Okay. I can tell you that I'm not even a political scientist, so I'm a social scientist, but I'm a demographer and geographer, really, and so I'm really out of my domain here, but I'm not sure what I can contribute. But since I got invited, I've been giving some thought to some of these issues, and I met Justin actually at a similar symposium at Duke a couple years ago, and he's gotten me thinking about these things for the first time in my life. So I'm a novice, and I apologize if I'm going to do cover some material that is already out there, but nevertheless, here it is. So at this time of the decade, we know that politicians are really interested in maps. And we know that there's an importance to boundaries. When the lines are drawn with one party in control, there's a particularly significant problem. And so we can look at Ohio because that's the case in Ohio. One party has been in control of drawing the boundaries. And so this is a graph that I produced that shows the percent of votes and also the elections won in the 2000s in congressional races in the state. And the hatched mark is the number of votes that the Democrats attained in that election, and the solid red is the number of seats won. I'm sorry, this is for the Republicans. So the Republicans won 57% of the vote in 2002, but they got 2/3 of all the seats. There were 18 at the time throughout this period. And you can see that they won a disproportionate number of seats compared to the percentage of the vote that they attained, and that is because they were involved in drawing those boundaries back in 2001. So the effect of their drawing the boundaries lasted throughout the decade, basically. The 2008 election was a little bit different because of the Obama effect, but nevertheless, still there. The other thing is that you look at graphs for the state legislature, and it's very similar to this. Okay, so it's not just congressional seats. So I figured that in each of those elections, the Republicans won some additional seats because of the way they drew the boundaries, and that's the number at the bottom. So they won 2 extra seats in 2002, 3 and 4, 2 again, and then 1 in 2008, and 3 in 2010, just because of the way the boundaries are drawn, basically, is what I'm saying. The national picture, try to look at some national data. So here's a chart that shows the additional seats won by who drew the lines from 2002 through 2010. This is the total number of seats during the 2000 decade. And when I took some information from the Brennan Guide for Redistricting out of their book and used some of their categories about who was actually in control of the drawing of boundaries 10 years before, in 2001. And so when the Democrats were in control in those states, they won a total of 18 seats more than their proportion of the votes would have indicated, okay? So when the Democrats were in control, they won, of drawing the boundaries, they won more seats, total of 18 in 2000, over the period, over the decade. When the Republicans at the other end of this graph were in control of certain states. They won 16. Ignore the minuses in order to draw the graph. I had pluses and minuses. But they won 16 seats more than they would have based simply on the proportion of votes that they got in those states. And then other categories I thought would be interesting, and I'm not sure how well I summarized each state. So somebody who's more knowledgeable about what's happening in each of the 50 states, at least those that weren't Democrat and Republican controlled, might be able to improve on my grouping here. But those which were drawn by courts actually favored the Democrats overall by 6. And those with the Republican governor but with a split legislature of one kind or another also benefited the Democrats overall in that decade. And you can see the distribution of the other categories as well. I thought that not being a political scientist and not knowing any better, I thought, well, with a Republican governor but with a Democratic legislature, the legislature could override at least in some cases, override the Republican governor's veto. And so I thought, well, they would probably have more in the red category than you see here. And I don't know why they don't, but again, somebody who knows the individual states better than I do could probably maybe help in refining which states got assigned to each category. But there are some results. The total votes over that decade were 51% Democrat, by the way, and 46% Republican when you add them all up. And there were 64 seats that were won disproportionate to their number of votes in those states for those parties. 32 for each party. So if you add up the 18, 6, and 8, that doesn't add to 32, does it? Well, anyway, the net difference was 0 over the decade. So there was no advantage that the Republicans or Democrats had in the number of seats that they won as a result of redistricting, because they washed out one way or another over the whole country. Okay. I looked at the same kind of data over time just to see what I would see. And so, again, these are the states that had Democrats in control of the redistricting process 10 years before. And you can see the effect in the first year, which is this brown shading here. The impact of the first election after the redistricting was pretty significant. Again, they lost 8 to the Republicans when the Republicans were in control in that first year. After that, it's a little bit of a mixed bag, and I'm not sure what's happening, and people in political science could probably explain a lot of these patterns, and I can't. So in aggregate, over the last decade, the national totals for wins by the two parties closely reflect the percentage of votes for congressional candidates for the two parties. Apparently, courts' interventions made some difference, however. Within states, however, boundaries that don't reflect the preferences of the electorate means that votes don't count the same, is a statement I want to make. And I'll sort of show you some data about that. What I've come up with is a phrase that maybe is not appropriate, but wasted Democratic votes. And this is in Ohio. And what I've got here is the green bars represent in each of the years the votes needed by Democrats to attain the number of wins they actually achieved. Okay, so you can see that number. Out of the total votes for the Republicans and Democrats, what did they need in terms of total votes to achieve the number of seats that they actually won? That's the green. The red is the actual number of votes that they got. Okay, in the state for congressional races in the year. And so and then also subtracted out those that were for independent candidates, so they're not included in here. So the yellow bars represent what I call wasted votes. These are votes by Democrats that they didn't have to go to the polls and bother, basically. Okay. So one person, one vote, I guess, is not working very well in a situation in which there's total partisan control of the redistricting process. Would be what I would conclude. I'm not sure anybody else would, but I would. So the other question I wanted to address in my presentation, though, is I'm a geographer, and so the question is drawing those boundary lines, and who draws them is interesting to me. And the question is, could public engagement make a difference in how all this comes out? And this is what we in geography, in a field called public participation GIS. The planners also have public participation planning, And we in the GIS or geography field talk about public participation GIS, where people can actually get involved in using GIS technology, mapping technology, to implement public policy or to influence public policy, basically. So, how do maps drawn by politicians compare to those drawn by citizens? If the criteria were agreed to first, at least. We discussed the outcomes of a process in which internet-based geographic information systems, GIS technology, enables the public to draw congressional district plans cheaply and easily, instead of the way you see in the photograph. Let's compare alternative plans drawn by participants in 2 competitions in Ohio to draw plans with plans drawn by the official political partisan establishment. There were 2 cases that I can very briefly talk about. One is a project that was done by in the state of Ohio back in 2009 that we were involved with, helping on a technical basis, in which the Secretary of State wanted to test out the feasibility of having an internet GIS redistricting application and having people be able to participate in that and submit plans that would show whether or not they could produce congressional districts which were better or worse than the actual districts drawn 9 years or 8 years before that, and to see whether or not it was possible to come up with a mechanism in which the public could offer plans that met certain criteria that people could agree to about how useful the criteria were, how appropriate they were, and what would be the results. So I'll talk about that one very briefly. And then also there's a more recent one, which is more of a live one that actually was implemented in Ohio and other states called the Midwest Democracy Network. So first, the 2009 Secretary of State's redistricting competition. The objective of the competition was to open the process to the public, rely on objective rules that everyone follows. Objectives include preserve Ohio communities and promote competition. So competition was important, number of competitive districts. And anyone could submit a plan. The software and training would be free to participants. OSU provided a terminal server, computer access to run the software over the internet, saving licensing fees and making it available to anyone with internet access. You could participate if you were in China or anywhere else. Thus, it's a public participation GIS, PPGIS. Before the plan could be considered, 3 thresholds had to be met: population equality, contiguity of the districts, and you had to observe the requirements of the National Voting Rights Act. You had at least one minority, a majority minority congressional district in the state, as we have now. Then the other criteria were scored in some manner. The criteria included compactness, and I won't go into all the details. Communities of interest was an objective. Competitiveness, how many districts would be judged to be competitive. And also representational fairness, which is the concept I was just talking about before, with whether or not the number of seats party won was proportionate to the number of votes they got in the state. And the results of the competition were that 14 plans were submitted, although there were 70 participants signed up, and the software was less than easy to use, let me just say, and I think it prohibited some people from finishing. There were 3 plans were disqualified because they didn't meet the initial criteria, and 3 plans were declared as winning plans. So here's the current, until this next election at least, the 18 congressional districts that were established in January 2002. And the scoring of them is that, in terms of the criteria, 13 are leaning Republican and 5 leaning Democrat, if you look at the distribution of the votes in those districts. 7 of the 18, or 39% of the congressional districts, were rated as competitive, and 44 counties were fragmented into 2 or more congressional districts. And there were several that are not very contiguous, and you can see one that, for example, follows Appalachia along the Ohio River here. And it could be argued that that's a good thing because you want Appalachians to have a representative Congress, but that's another issue. The winning submitted plan is seen here in this map, and by comparison, there were 9 leaning Republican and 9 leaning Democratic districts. 10 of the 18, or 56% of the districts, were rated as competitive. There were only 7 county fragments, which was one of the criteria set up for the competition, and they're certainly more compact than the actual plan. And in fact, Even the worst scoring plan submitted in the competition was quantitatively better than the actual 2000 redistricting plan. Okay? So it was an interesting project. The other one that I'll mention is the one that you might hear about later, I'm not sure, but the Midwest Democracy Network. And just really quickly, there were several states, including Ohio, that were set up by the Midwest Mapping Project to use some software that would allow people, citizens, to construct some redistricting plans and be scored and quantitatively evaluated, et cetera. And there was a software system that was developed. Michael McDonald is the person who was behind this, one of the people at least behind. And I'm sorry, and Mike Altman was also involved in this. And they built a much better user interface than the one that was used 2 years before in the 2009 competition. And it was implemented in Ohio and the other states. And this is a comparison. I pulled this off their website actually, that shows the comparison between the plan that was recently approved by the Republican-controlled process in Ohio still, as it was 10 years ago. So this is the plan that was approved in recent days by the Republicans, and this is the plan that was submitted by the winning submittal from the competition. And down here they list the comparison statistics. 65 of the county fragments divides 27 counties, splits 7 counties into 3 districts, et cetera, on the currently approved plan versus 21 county fragments dividing 9 counties, splits only 2 counties into 3 districts, et cetera. And 2 competitive districts, none highly competitive, 11 competitive districts versus 8 highly competitive, et cetera. So all the statistics show that the one drawn by a citizen, well actually this is by Senator Sawyer, but I think it was, he may or may not have taken one that was submitted by another contestant or tweaked it or something, but it's very similar to a number of the other plans that were submitted by actual citizens. So a quote from the website: "We scored the maps like we did 53 maps submitted during our redistricting competition, and guess what we found? The House Bill 319, which is the one officially adopted, scored dead last, far worse than every other map submitted during our competition." That's a quote from their website. So I did my own mapping because I'm a geographer. I like making maps. So I did the sort of same thing, and this is the one that was officially approved by the state legislature, and I categorized the districts a little differently than maybe the Midwest project did. But those that were, and I used 2 years of election results, 2008 and 2010. Those are the election years for which we had results to use. So I averaged the results from those 2 years, and then categorized. The colors indicate whether or not they're very Republican, extremely Republican, very Republican, or just Republican or competitive, or very Democrat, or extremely Democrat, very Democrat, or just Democrat leaning or competitive. And so you can see by the color arrangements that these are the only ones that are competitive. And there were 3 that could be judged as competitive, between 45 and 55% of the votes going either way. And then the one that was, and so there results in 9 Republican, basically, 4 Democrat and 3 competitive. And if you look at the Sawyer plan, the one that was in the competition, you can see that using the same criteria, there are actually 5 Republican leaning districts, 3 Democrat leaning, and 8 competitive districts. So anyway, it's a similar evaluation than the other folks did. So now, of course, if you're aware of what's happening in Ohio, the Democrats are threatening court action, and it's been in the papers, and it's a mess, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen. But if a compromise is not reached, the legislative plan may be put to a vote in the coming year through a referendum. And finally, my conclusion is that we have a long way to go to achieve the objective expressed by one person, one vote. Engaging the public in the process through new technologies, however, could help. This one, yeah, go down here.
All right. Well, we're I want to thank Case Western Law School for inviting me out here. Today I'm going to talk about, I started writing this paper prior to this being invited to the conference, but I think it's a perfect fit. I'm talking about population deviations in legislative redistricting, and basically, I don't think we've mentioned it here today, but there's actually a legal distinction and a real distinction in terms of what kinds of deviations are allowable according to the courts for congressional on one hand and then state legislative on the other. And so today I'm talking about state legislative redistricting rather than congressional redistricting. So again, the reason why we have single member districts in the first place, right? The main reason is to move, if you think about it compared to an at-large system, if we elected everybody at large, basically the majority would win 100%, should win 100% of the seats if they stick together and they sort of have equal quality candidates. So moving to a single member district system allows a move towards proportionality. It's not proportional, but it gets you closer to proportionality. Okay, so, and I hadn't thought about sort of Justin's example. If you have single member districts but are completely unconstrained, it doesn't get you very far proportionally, right? If you were allowed to draw the minority into one single district. So single member districts without some sort of real population equality, I think, is kind of meaningless given Justin's example. So I won't go over the history, but again, this is the reapportionment revolution in the 1960s, was this Baker v. Carr and the string of decisions that were made shortly thereafter that all had to do with population equality. And again, this was the sort of the court first getting involved in redistricting. All had to do with population equality. And the thing that I'm talking about is sort of the last vestige, I think, of what's left over in this particular issue. So the first thing I just wanted to show you was how you calculate deviations. You know, so when you draw a districting plan, first you have to figure out what the ideal population in a district is, and it's very simple. You just take the total population as reported by the census, divided by the number of seats you're drawing them into, and that's your ideal population. So when we talk about deviations, all that is you know, take the district that has the highest proportion, the highest number of people in it. Take the district that has the lowest number of people in it, and then figure out what that spread is, right? And then you can get an idea of a percentage deviation from ideal. That's typically the way, but it's a straightforward way to do this sort of thing. So that's what I'm talking about, an inequality of total population across districts, but within a single state, right? I'm not addressing, there's still going to be differences across states, both in congressional, which is probably unfair, and then also in state legislative, but states are free to choose whatever size state legislatures they want to have, so there's no sort of fairness issues there. Okay, so the reason why there's a distinction in allowable population deviations is that the court found different constitutional reasons for requiring population equality for congressional and state legislative. For congressional, it was straight out of Article 1. But for state legislative districts, the constitutional foundation was an equal protection claim. So that's sort of, and of course we know equal protection doesn't mean perfectly equal, right? And so that's why, for some reason, we have these allowable, we've ended up with this notion that state legislative districts, there's some allowable tolerance for population deviations. And basically I'm going to argue against those deviations altogether. So in one person, one vote, I don't want to talk about this a lot today, but if you think about, this is starting to bubble up, particularly in Texas and other states with lots of Hispanic voters, is there's still possibly, if we sort of take one person, one vote seriously, and perhaps Baker versus Carr seriously, we still might have big problems, because right now we're equalizing population from the census. We're not equalizing on other variables like voters, for instance, and so you still could, the weight of your vote can depend heavily on where you live in a state, particularly if there's lots of Hispanics that aren't citizens, and there's currently a lawsuit in Irving, Texas, that's what they're trying to say, you know, hey court, you haven't really taken this line of reasoning seriously, so there's a distinction between one person, one vote, and then also how we draw districts, which has to do with representation, and if we really take one person, one vote seriously, then we should be drawing districts on the basis of maybe the number of voters, right, or maybe the number of citizens, voting age population, or something like that. So there are lots of other ways we could draw districts. And I'm not advocating one or the other here today, but I think there's a serious sort of underlying question that we can think about that has sort of deep representational implications. Okay, so the deviations, the current controlling case for congressional districts is Carter v. Daggett, and there's two questions that you have to answer. Could population differences be reduced or eliminated with a good faith effort? They almost always can. And then if the good faith effort wasn't made, can the state prove that each variance from ideal was necessary to achieve some legitimate goal? And again, recently, the different courts, right, obviously, you guys know that different courts come up with different decisions. There have been allowable deviations from ideal population in Congress. More recently, though, states basically just decide to equalize population more or less down to the single person. There was a case out of Pennsylvania where a 3-judge federal panel threw out a Pennsylvania redistricting, congressional redistricting plan because it deviated by 19 people. And these were districts of 650,000 people. But again, when they asked, I was actually part of that case, and when they asked the guy that drew the districts, well, why did you stop at 19? He's like, well, my boss told me that was close enough. So the court was kind of forced a little bit, right? And obviously he wasn't prepared very well by the lawyers. They should have had some reason why that. But he just said, look, my boss said, it's 2 a.m. and we got within 19 people. Let's call it a day. So the court threw that out. All right. So what are some of the legitimate goals for allowing deviations? First is compactness, and that's sort of how the districts look. The second is respecting existing political boundaries, county lines, municipal lines, etc. Preserving the core of prior districts is a legitimate goal, and then avoiding putting two incumbents against one another is also a legitimate reason for these deviations. Okay, so sort of very recently there's been, I already mentioned the Veith case in Pennsylvania that struck down a map for a 19-person deviation. And for legislative districts, so basically 1 person, 1 vote is taken very seriously for congressional. Legislative districts, until this Larios case in 2004, basically everybody's understanding, and I think sort of everybody would agree on this ahead of time, was that there was a safe harbor, right? The legal sense of the term, that you can have a 10% deviation that you don't need to justify whatsoever. As long as you're within 10, that's a safe harbor. We don't even care. Unfortunately, or fortunately, from my perspective, I suppose, the Democrats in Georgia, including elected officials, were sort of very brazen about what they were doing, and they drew a very gerrymandered map, and they also used these deviations in the way that I would expect everybody to use them, which was to underpopulate your own districts and overpopulate your opponent's districts, but they were sort of too brazen about it, and I think they kind of forced the court's hand into doing something that maybe they wouldn't have done otherwise if the members weren't so vocal about what was going on. All right. So my biggest concern about population deviations is that it's a simple, easy, and effective tool for a gerrymanderer, somebody interested in drawing a gerrymander, to use, and so that's why I think we ought to get rid of it. Again, like I said, all you do is you have to overpopulate districts for the other party and underpopulate districts for your own, and that's going to give you an added efficiency and allow you to win several more seats in the overall, the aggregate translation of votes into seats. All right. This is something I've been saying for a long time, and I just decided, a few months ago to start writing this down. But I think the sort of knee-jerk reaction is that deviations should be allowed. Okay, and there's a lot of reasons for that. First, the census data are, in fact, only an estimate of the true population. Right, the census data are wrong. Right, it's impossible to be right to begin with. Even if they were right, it would only be right instantaneously. Right, in the very next second, some number of people are going to be born, and some number of people are going to die. And so I think that's the people's first reaction. Well, the census data are the census data. They're kind of an estimate of the population. So why would we require equal population based upon what's really a fiction, right? What's really a fictitious number, right? And my sort of response is that it's a fiction in the sense that it's not right, but it's the best that we have, right? So we have to just sort of rely on it and say, okay, the census says, Texas has, 32,560,000 people, 402, right? At one point it probably did. Who knows when that was? That doesn't today, right? But let's just say that that's how many they have, because that's going to make our lives a lot easier. The the governor of Texas wanted me to tell you guys, thanks for the 2 seats, right? And we got 4 this time. He didn't really say that. He's busy. He's busy doing something else. So the second reason why people's typical reaction to deviations, for allowing deviations, is that we need to keep communities of interest whole. So why split apart a county or a city just to get with this, you know, to equalize population numbers? You know, wouldn't it be nice if county X or city X were kept whole in a perfect district? And I can tell you, having been to many sort of public hearings about redistricting, is that people that work for cities and counties, that's all they talk about. You know, please keep us whole, and if you don't keep us whole, make sure we're making a majority, and all these sorts of things. So cities and counties want to maximize their power, just like individuals do, and they don't want to split into be you know, a small chunk in lots of different districts, which is what may happen if we don't sort of respect these lines. For me, cities and counties aren't communities of interest. You know, any line, any boundary has been made up, right? They're completely arbitrary. There's this great book, and they actually made a TV show called How the States Got Their Shapes. You know, and so, and my undergraduate students always have this, you know, gut reaction, you know, like I was talking about how the Senate should be dismantled because, you know, we live in Texas and Wyoming. There's only 3 people living in Wyoming, and we all live here. Why should they get 2 senators? Oh, no, the states. I'm like, you know, if you fly over the country, those lines aren't really there. You know, somebody just made them up, and there was little battles that went on. They adjusted them, and so forget about them, that they're of any interest at all, because it's not a community of interest, right? It's a political entity designed to provide services to the people. So for me, equalizing the power of individual votes is more important than worrying about pre-existing arbitrary boundaries. And like I said before, deviations are, by and large, used for partisan purposes, not for these other great things like keeping communities whole. So this is the example I gave, and I just saw in Mark's slides. Ohio has sort of similar. I think Texas is the exemplar, right? If you really, oh God, counties are so important. I mean, look at that. They just drew a grid, you know, and those there wasn't existing political, you know, interest in these square grids in Texas when they drew these sorts of things. And I was trying to figure out, you know, trying to look into the history of how these counties got the way that they, you know, ended up the way that they are, and haven't been very successful at doing this yet. But our counties used to be larger, I do know that. And I think they made them smaller, you know, for one of these things like, well, everybody should be able to ride their horse to the county seat inside one day or something like that. But regardless, right, they just sort of got out their graph paper and kind of overlaid it, especially, you know, up there in northern Texas, and drew some grids. And counties are clearly the building blocks for both legislative and congressional districts. But and a lot of times we sort of quantify, you know, well, how well does this map protect community? Oh my gosh, only 2 minutes. How well does this map protect communities of interest? Well, how many counties did they split? And for me, that's like, and I've done that too. I've testified in that in court, how important that is. But you know, I think at some level, individuals are more important than preserving county lines. All right, so I better hurry. I haven't even got to my data yet. So what have I done here? I want to show that redistrictors are partisan, and they're going to use these population deviations to their advantage. So I got data on which party controlled the districts after all the 2002 elections. I'm only do state lower chamber districts here. I didn't do the upper chambers yet. So it's only state legislative lower chamber things. I used Professor McDonald's codes for who controlled districting in each state in 2000. I did make some changes to it. For instance, if he whenever he used a code for divided legislative control, what happens in those instances a lot of time is that the one party in the one chamber will gerrymander theirs, the other party in the other chamber will gerrymander theirs, and they'll both sort of log roll and say, okay, yours is good, ours is good. So I changed it for those things, but the rest of the codes I've used. And again, my hypothesis is that partisan districting will lead to systematic differences in population for the two parties. And these are the data. I'm sort of happy with them. I thought it'd be even starker, but let me explain what's going on. All the bars on the left are states where Democratic districts have fewer people than Republican districts do, okay? So the first bar, you can't see, it's actually Georgia. Georgia's the exemplar. for all this sort of thing. That had the biggest deviation. So almost all of the Republican districts were overpopulated. Almost all of the districts the Democrats won were underpopulated. So as we move towards the middle, there's these 5 or 6 states that basically had no deviations whatsoever. They kind of did it like congressional seats would. And then to the right are states that favored Republican parties. Okay, so now the colors indicate who was in charge of redistricting. Blue bars indicate the Democrats were in charge, right? Red bars indicated the Republicans were in charge. And then the brownish ones are a court or special masters or something other than a partisan thing. So again, most of the blue bars, but not all, most of the blue bars are on the left, and the biggest deviations are all blue. The Republicans, I'm not quite sure what to think. You know, maybe they need to get their act together. They're not doing it nearly as well as the Democrats do, but certainly the biggest deviations on the right are mainly Republican states. Let me skip ahead. Here I just broken them down by the 3 different ones. Here's sort of showing you an example of how I calculated those bars, right? These are the Democratic districts and the Republican districts, and these are just smooth histograms of how much they deviate. So you can see the Democratic districts are all under the deviation, and all the Republican ones are packed with basically 5% over. So it's kind of 5% under, 5% over. Utah, this was the exemplar for the Republicans ones, and then I hate to give Iowa credit because good government people always love to point to Iowa as you know, this is how we all need to redistrict, and I think that's by and large not true, but I have to give kudos, you know, where a kudo is due, and so Iowa restricted themselves to a 1% deviation, which is better than 5%, and there wasn't really a systematic partisan component to it. So conclusion. Population deviations weren't perfectly aligned with partisanship, but there were states that used this for partisan reasons in 2000. 10% is really arbitrary, right? So for me, the only non-arbitrary deviation is 0, right? Anything else is arbitrary. 1%, 10 people, 100 people. So let's just go with 0 because it's easy. It's not hard to zero out population deviations. And like I said, I think equalizing the power of votes is more important than trying to justify deviations. Thank you.
Again, I'm John Griffin from Notre Dame, and this is a joint project with Brian Newman, who's at Pepperdine University. So Brian and I are longtime collaborators, former co-graduate students, in fact, and so the lesson here for the law students in the audience is that sometimes your classmates are your partners, not always your rivals. This talk is titled Voting Power, Policy Representation, and the Equality of Voting's Rewards. And what I hope to show you, is sort of consistent with the last couple papers, is that citizens in the United States don't have equal voting power. I'll define what that means in a moment. And that this leads to inequalities in policy representation, with an implication that the rewards of voting are different across groups of citizens, politically relevant groups of citizens. So I think it's there's broad agreement that if we're going to take anything out of this line of cases coming out of Baker v. Carr, is that there's a principle articulated as Professor Zakharoff articulated this morning, that individuals should have an individual equal right of participation, whether this is captured by the one person, one vote standard, or that citizens' votes should have equal weight. I want to take one step back from that and sort of heretically ask, well, why? Why should we care if citizens' votes have equal weight? Well, we might care for the first reason, which is that it recognizes that citizens have equal dignity. And this is, I think, reflected in, perhaps, in this view that that voting is a fundamental right. But as
You can correct me if I'm wrong, but again, Professor Zakharov's comments this morning suggested, we really care about the equality of voting because voting gets translated into political power and that citizens are able to protect their interests and advance their interests through the political system. And so, for example, if I have 2 votes and she has 1, and we're represented by the same person, there's a reason why that person would take my call but not hers. Similarly, when that person is casting a vote, that they would pay attention to what I have to say and not what she has to say. And so we want citizens' votes to have the same weight because those votes are translatable into power. Okay? So what I'm going to do today is say, well, when we talk about one person, one vote, we're essentially arguing that we want citizens to have equal voting power. Okay? And the reason we want them to have equal voting power is we want them to be represented equally, at least based on those votes. And then finally, we want to, I think we want to, what I'm going to look at is whether those who vote are rewarded equally for their votes. So to sum up, I'm going to say 50 years after Baker v. Carr, are the rewards of voting equal? Do citizens have equal voting power, and are they rewarded equally for their participation? Well, why might we think that today, after Baker v. Carr and Reynolds v. Sims and Westbury, et cetera, why might we think that citizens still have unequal voting power? Okay, we've seen a couple examples of how this might be. I want to construct a fairly straightforward, I think, theory as follows. Let's assume that officials are elected in single-member districts and that they desire re-election. And additionally, let's say that some groups of citizens are able to contribute more to this re-election effort than others. Okay. One is that groups, politically relevant groups, might turn out at different rates. And if they vote at higher levels, then elected officials should say, well, that's a group that votes at high levels, I should pay more attention to that group. Secondly, groups might contribute differently to re-election because of their tendency to vote for one of the parties more than the other. Okay? This might be counter to your intuition. If a group votes strongly for one of the parties, that doesn't mean the party should be more responsive to it. It might mean it's less, right? Because if a group is entirely, say, captured by one of the parties, that party can reliably count on its votes. Similarly, the other party knows that it will never win those votes. So a group in this sense can contribute more to a re-election effort of an official if it's a swing group. Okay. And finally, we might look at group size, that bigger groups can contribute more votes, all else equal, to the re-election of a representative. So thirdly, let's say that elected officials have, as a resource, roll calls that they can use to attract the electoral support of groups. That when elected officials cast votes, they see, what do groups care about? How big are they? Are they in my camp or the other camp? Did they tend to vote? And then, when I'm casting my vote, I might take those considerations into account. And finally, we would then conclude that those groups that are anticipated to contribute more to an official's re-election should see their views better represented. So what I want to do next is to look at different politically relevant subgroups in the United States and to ask how do they stack up in terms of these 3 contributions to group voting power. I'll talk about actually just 2 of them. And then I'll describe the group voting power across the U.S. And I'm going to look at racial and ethnic groups, I'm going to look at gender groups, and I'm going to look at income groups. And I picked those 3 because of the historical experience of those groups with respect to the franchise in particular. If we look at the average turnout of these subpopulations, aggregating over a couple of 3 presidential elections, there's not a lot of huge surprises. African Americans and Latinos turn out at lower rates than whites. Women actually turn out at somewhat higher rates than men. And higher income groups turn out at higher rates than lower income groups. In terms of their tendency to vote for one of the parties, we could say that a group would have the most voting power, would be strongest if its turnout propensity was, in this graph, close to 50%. 50% support for the Democratic presidential candidate. Again, this is aggregating over over a couple of elections, 3 elections, 4 elections. What's most evident in this graph is that there are huge disparities in terms of race and ethnicity, that African Americans are much, much more likely to vote for Democrats, as are Latinos as compared to whites. That women have less voting power than men on this score, and that low-income groups have less voting power than middle and high-income groups. Again, because they're much more likely to vote for Democrats than for Republicans. I won't put up census data on group size. I think we all have a sense for the size of these groups in the country. So what I then did was I took the National Annenberg Election Study, which is a sample of about 60,000 Americans, nationally representative sample. And for every individual in that data set, calculated a voting power score in three directions. So every individual in the Annenberg data has a race and ethnicity, they have a gender, and they have an income category. And each one of those will create some contribution to their overall voting power. And importantly, that voting power is derived from their context or where they live, right? So if you are an individual African American and reside in a place with lots of other African Americans, even if you as an individual are a voter, okay, and even if you vote Republican, a representative of that district will, because of the pattern of behavior of the other people that live in that district, assume that that is a district that leans heavily Democratic, that has a low turnout rate, et cetera. And so, so what we're doing with these voting power scores is attributing contextual measures to individuals and then assigning levels of voting power to individuals. So, so we have basically 9 measures of, or 3 measures of voting power, which are then aggregated for each individual and then aggregated within groups. And this is what it looks like. It's a little bit hard to get a sense for what these scores mean on the y-axis, but in the interest of time, I won't develop that. The important point is that whites are much more, have much more voting power than African Americans and Latinos. Men have a little bit more voting power than women do. And high and middle income voters have more voting power than low income voters. I should say that all of the contextual data is from a congressional district level. So, so point number 1 is groups in the United States, politically relevant groups in the United States today don't have equal voting power as reflected in by these 3 metrics. So the next question then is, well, why does this matter? Is this voting power, you know, the greater voting power, for example, of whites or high income voters or men, is it translated into any political advantage? So in order to get at that, I compared the political positions that individuals took on that Annenberg survey that I just mentioned on these 9 or so issues on the left-hand side of this slide to the actual voting behavior of their member of Congress on what I would argue is a closely related bill. So the third bill on the list, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, prior to that vote, citizens were asked on the Annenberg study, do you in general favor more free trade agreements? If in that case the citizen or the individual responded, yes, I support free trade agreements, and their member voted in favor of CAFTA, then that citizen was scored a winner on that vote. Okay. So then we can aggregate those scores across all 9 votes and then assign each of the individuals on the Annenberg study sort of an overall win ratio is what we call it. So from a 0 out of 9 to 1 out of 9. Or 0 out of 9 to 9 out of 9. Okay. Now, just looking at how groups fare in terms of that win ratio measure, this is what we would see. That whites in general tend to have greater policy congruence with their elected officials than Latinos and African Americans. Women and men about the same. Higher income groups more than low income groups. And this echoes work that I've done elsewhere and work by Larry Bartels as well. But what we're really interested in is whether group voting power translates into better representation. In other words, whether this graph is related to the graph that we saw of differential group voting power. And that's what this model is meant to examine. So this is the result of a regression. It doesn't matter if you use a nonlinear model. But what we're looking at here is individual voting power and how it affects that individual level measure of win ratio. So how does my voting power based on my race, ethnicity, and income, or race, gender, and income affect how strongly congruent my congressman votes with me on those 9 issues. Controlling for race, income, gender, as well as things like whether I'm a co-partisan, whether I live in a diverse district, et cetera, et cetera. So the important thing is the top line, which is that those with more voting power receive better representation in the United States. The last thing I want to touch on is what I think is a key implication of this finding, which is that there are unequal rewards for voting across groups in the United States. Okay? So how do I get to that conclusion? Well, logically, so let's assume, first of all, that members of Congress disregard the opinions of non-voters, regardless of their voting power. So everybody has a level of voting power based on their context and their, again, those ascriptive characteristics about the individual. But let's assume for the moment that if you're not a voter, then members are not going to pay attention to what you have to say about policies. Well, we've just seen that members are more attentive to those with substantial voting power than to those that have less voting power. Well, if that's true, then those with more voting power are going to receive a greater reward for voting within their groups. Or as this famous political scientist Walter D. Burnham put it, if you don't vote, you don't count. We extend that to say, but are all votes counted equally? This again is represented in a table form rather than graphically. Graphically, what we would see is what we're essentially doing here is comparing within groups. Okay, so we have subsamples. This is 8 different models. So among African Americans is the first estimate. Among African Americans, are those who vote? Do those who vote have higher levels of policy congruence with their members of Congress than those that don't vote? And then controlling for all the stuff at the bottom. Okay, obviously not African American in that case, but all of the other factors. Again, the second model would be among Latinos, do those who vote have a higher levels of policy congruence compared to those that don't vote? And what we see is that, I guess looking first at racial and ethnic groups, that whites are rewarded for voting, Latinos are rewarded for voting, African Americans are not rewarded for voting. So African Americans who vote don't have any higher levels of policy congruence with their members of Congress than those that don't vote. So this is especially troubling given the motivations that Professor Zakharoff described behind Baker v. Carr and trying to increase the political equality of racial groups. Looking then at the 4th and 5th columns, largely as we would have expected, men receive somewhat larger rewards for voting than women do because men have slightly more voting power than women do on average, in large part because women are more disposed to vote for Democrats than for Republicans. And then looking at the last 3 columns, we see that higher and middle income voters receive much greater rewards for voting than low income voters do. So these are disconcerting findings, not only because they represent or reflect unequal rewards for voting, but because they exacerbate some of the inequalities that we already saw before. In other words, before they vote, groups are unequal. And after they vote, there are some groups whose advantages increased even more, whereas, for example, African Americans gain no advantage by voting, according to these data. The last slide, I guess I'll show, is that groups recognize this. Okay, so this survey asked people, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? People like me have no say over what the government does. Essentially, that's what we mean by efficacy here. Okay, and the first row tells us how much being a voter increases an individual's sense that the government cares about what they have to say. And these findings closely parallel those in the prior slide. Blacks who vote have no greater sense that government cares about what they have to say as compared to blacks that don't vote. That's what the first column shows. Whereas whites and Latinos who vote do. Men receive more of a sort of efficacy reward for voting. And then middle and high income voters receive slightly more efficacy or have a greater sense of political power than low income voters do. again, thanks for organizing this workshop. It's a fantastic idea. Special kudos to whoever came up with the idea of having it in the 49th year rather than the 50th year and beat all the other law schools to the punch.
No, I don't.
Okay.
No. This is not your computer, is it?
No.
Hi. Thanks again to the editors of the Case Western Law Review and the faculty here for being great hosts. You guys have done a great job, and it's great to be here for this timely event. I have to confess that when I accepted the offer to participate in this symposium about 6 months ago, I thought I would have a paper, actually. It would be great to kind of play out the paper before you guys and get thoughts. I don't have a paper. I didn't realize that 2 months later I'd become associate dean of faculty at Emory Law School, kind of against my will. And as those of you who are on law faculty know, the associate deans of faculty at least spend their time mostly, predominantly, almost all my time, dealing with other things than my own research. And in fact, I've spent literally no time on that paper that I was planning on presenting. Yeah, literally no time. So, so instead, I've got some kind of rough observations about the redistricting process this cycle in Georgia and California. And so this is to some degree off the cuff, but they're related to things that I've been thinking about. First, in Georgia, about what Ashcroft means, looking back with the perspective of another redistricting cycle. And then in California, the debate about communities of interest and the way that redistricting has been going on there with the Citizens Commission that's making the decisions in California. Okay, so first Georgia. So those of us that think a lot about voting rights, we all remember the arguments of African American leaders in Georgia and Ashcroft that represented a kind of shift from the traditional positions of African American leadership on the VRA, certainly from the 1990s. And they argued that Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act should permit what was really a democratic gerrymander in Georgia, unpacking African American voters from supermajority minority districts to spread out Democratic strength and increase the chances that Democrats would hold the legislature. And they wanted essentially to trade off descriptive representation, which had been the focus of the VRA, for greater democratic success, essentially. And what this recognized was the idea that African American prospects were more closely aligned with the number of Democrats elected rather than necessarily the number of African American elected officials who won office. So out of Ashcroft, you had emerging a kind of modern conception of racial politics that's rooted in some pretty major sociopolitical changes that had occurred since 1965, right, since the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Now flash forward to today, and there's a kind of symmetry or continuation of a lot of the arguments that Democrats and African American leaders are taking today in opposition to a Republican gerrymander, now that Republicans have taken over pretty much everything in the state of Georgia. This cycle, the current Republican plan, according to projections I've seen, it looks like 49 of the 57 seats that Democrats are projected to win are going to be African American elected officials elected out of those seats. So this is essentially making the Democratic Party African American. There's very few white Democrats that we expect to be elected, with, of course, the Republicans commanding both houses of the legislature. And the Democrats here are again arguing that there should be fewer majority-minority districts, fewer African American leaders elected to the state legislature. And it's in fact these African American leaders, for instance, Stacey Abrams, an African American woman, Democratic House leader, who are making these arguments. So there's a kind of continuation of what we saw in Ashcroft and the position that African Americans and Democrats are taking here. There's a bit of an added twist, because here the Democrats now are arguing that the Republicans are purposely pairing white Democrats, white incumbent Democrats, and African American Democratic candidates. in an effort to essentially purge the Democratic Party of white Democrats and make the Democratic Party in Georgia the black party and marginalize them in a way that sort of goes beyond simple gerrymandering. But putting that added twist aside, you see a lot of connections between the positions taken last cycle and this cycle. But there's been a major change, and that is now Republicans control the state. They control the redistricting process. So I think out of that, we can see two lessons when we think about looking back on Ashcroft with the perspective of this cycle. And I think what they tell us is that Ashcroft was more interesting as a political matter than a legal one. Okay, so on the one hand, the current redistricting cycle in Georgia shows the rightness, basically, of those who argued that Ashcroft represented this critical shift in the way that Democrats and African American fortunes were linked, and how it didn't make sense to focus too narrowly on descriptive representation in modern America anymore. Okay? And in fact, that linkage of racial and party fortunes has continued forward and lasted whether we have Democratic or Republican control. So we see the same thing going on now with Republicans in charge. It's not obvious that African American perceptions of self-interest would be essentially identical now that we have really Republican control and no foreseeable prospect of the Democrats taking back really any significant office in the state. I think that's pretty much unanimous view of people in Georgia. So that's one thing. So politically, we see the triumph of the kind of political conception of racial politics that we saw in Ashcroft. But on the other hand, I think the current cycle shows essentially how little was at stake legally in Ashcroft, and here's what I mean. So in Ashcroft, there was a Democratic gerrymander last cycle, and you had very particular facts. So you had Democratic control in a state that was very clearly swinging away from Democrats. It was gonna go Republican eventually. And it was such that you needed very, very aggressive gerrymandering and aggressive trading off of descriptive representation to keep Democratic control if there was to be any hope. So in that case, greater discretion to the state, essentially to the Democrats, was clearly more beneficial for African American interests, for Democratic interests. And trying to think along those lines, if you talk to some Democratic lawyers in the state of Georgia, what they say is, well, if only Ashcroft hadn't been overridden by Congress, we would be in better shape now, right? If only Ashcroft had stayed good law, we'd be in better shape now, we wouldn't be getting hammered. It's actually, I think, hard to see why that would be the case. So it's hard to see why Ashcroft, even assuming if it wasn't overridden by Congress, how it would help African Americans or the Democratic Party now. Because I think Ashcroft was mostly about discretion to the state through the Section 5 process and how to sort of conceive African Americans' political interests. And in this case now, with Republican control, it would simply give greater discretion to the Republicans in deciding how to gerrymander African Americans and Democrats, if it meant anything at all. Okay? And so today, it's not clear that Democrats would prefer that the Republican government have greater discretion. It's certainly not clear that the Republican government would prioritize greater Democratic strength over more descriptive representation. That seems unlikely. And certainly nothing in Ashcroft would have required the Republicans to do so, to spread out African American voters, trade off descriptive representation for greater partisan representation. That really doesn't make that much sense to me. Now, there is a sense in which this is about the rhetoric of the debate, and that is, right now Republicans are saying the VRA requires us to draw majority-minority districts. That's what it's all about. And so we have no choice in drawing all these majority-minority districts, because that's the command. And the Democrats, I guess, could argue if Ashcroft had not been overridden, they could have said, no, you actually do have a choice. You could spread out African-American voters and give us more seats, give the Democrats more seats at the expense of descriptive representation. That would have been fine. So I guess there's that. But it doesn't seem like Ashcroft would have a lot of bite in making the Republicans do what Democrats would like here. And in fact, Section 5 is really the only thing that keeps the Republicans from gerrymandering the Democrats and African Americans even worse. I mean, it's really the only thing that's holding the Republicans back at all in the state. Whether you think that's good or bad, I think that's true. Now, there is this kind of intriguing claim that the Democrats seem intent on making, which is, well, right now, consistent with the kind of the twist that I mentioned earlier, the Republicans are targeting white incumbents and pairing them with African American elected leadership in an effort to kind of marginalize the Democratic Party as the black party. And perhaps that's kind of racial intent that might worry us on in lots of ways. But it's certainly a kind of untraditional Section 5 kind of argument, at least as we've sort of thought about it more recently. So that's Ashcroft in Georgia. What about California and the Citizens Commission and communities of interest? So redistricting has generally been seen, or traditionally been seen, as a 14th Amendment problem. And the argument goes that the 14th Amendment ought to serve as some sort of check, some sort of prohibition on the government, and limit it in some sort of dilution sense. Basically, it's got to limit the degree to which the government can underrepresent certain politically salient groups. So it's been usually understood as a question of fair or unfair allocation of representation in what is almost always a kind of incumbent-dominated, politically self-interested process. And it's a negative framing, really, of redistricting, what the government can't do constitutionally. And what I find interesting about the redistricting process in California and the debate around it, and I guess commissions just generally, is that we have a real opportunity to think affirmatively about what we want from redistricting, right? Not what the government can't do, but what the government really should do. Political scientists have always thought along these lines, but I think election lawyers, we've thought a lot less about that. And we should think more about that. So the Citizens Commission, normally redistricting is done by the legislature, and it's really obvious what they're going to do. They're going to try to maximize all their political objectives, and so all you're trying to do is check that constitutionally as an election lawyer. The Citizens Commission, though, has essentially, with the guidance of certain kind of legal sources, a chance to do what they think is normatively the right thing. So the Citizens Commission is, for those of you who don't know, it's kind of like a citizens jury, right, that is going to actually draw the lines in California, that has drawn the lines in California. And so it's not obvious what they ought to do unless we have some kind of normative theory about what redistricting ought to do, how we ought to structure our districts. And what's emerged, I think, there may be some disagreement about this, but consistent with the representation focus of the 14th Amendment framing of redistricting that I mentioned, this discussion has tended to gravitate toward the fair allocation of group representation. So in California, this has meant a very big portion of the commission's deliberation and debate about what it's doing has centered on drawing districts around communities of interest. Okay, so figuring out what the salient groups are and drawing them districts that give them representation. And there's a forthcoming Harvard Law Review article that proposes creating homogeneous districts that have essentially as little internal diversity as possible, very consistent with the idea of communities of interest. And so I want to sound, I guess, a little note of caution about too great a focus on representation when we reframe redistricting in terms of affirmative principles, when we start to rethink the way election lawyers normally approach redistricting. And I'd argue that the 14th Amendment priors that we have and the framing that we've traditionally drawn upon aren't entirely helpful here beyond setting some outer bounds in some sort of dilution sense. And I'd argue that maybe the First Amendment might provide some affirmative guidance for redistricting here. Normally we think of the First Amendment more in terms of campaign finance and creating a healthy democratic structure. I think Sam mentioned that earlier in connection with the public financing case. But we might be able to bring some of that into redistricting, because what we are doing here is setting the parameters for electoral competition and representation. And Justice Kennedy, in fact, has kind of hinted at that this might be an approach that has some appeal to him in redistricting in the LULAC case. So what ideally do we want district lines to achieve as a normative matter? Well, one answer might be the allocation of safe representation for various groups. That's certainly one approach, and Tom has written really eloquently along those lines, and I have a lot of sympathy for that view, actually. But this type of homogeneity centered around communities of interest, generally as a theoretical matter, should be associated with less conflict and less of what I've called in other work democratic contestation. And so there is some work on political informational networks, and it suggests some sort of trade-off between homogeneity and deliberation. And the basic idea here is if you're around people who basically agree with you on most things, then you're going to agree and you're more likely to participate in politics. It's not really even about ideology necessarily. You're more likely to turn out. You're more likely to participate politically along lots of dimensions. But you may be a little bit less likely to think through your arguments because you're not really exposed to alternate viewpoints. If you're challenged a lot, you may deliberate a little bit more, but you may participate a little bit less. And so there might be a bit of a trade-off between participation and deliberation, between homogeneity and deliberation. And we might value deliberation at some level. Now, what this all means for districting is not perfectly clear. I don't pretend that it is. And as this kind of plays out empirically, what homogeneity or heterogeneity means at the district level, it's really hard to figure out. And the studies point in different directions. Homogeneity, heterogeneity correlate with lots of other things that are probably important in thinking about political behavior and thinking about deliberation, like media markets, geography, race. All of those things will be associated with competitiveness, turnout, other things we care about. So there's probably not a simple relationship between homogeneity, heterogeneity on the one hand, and other things we care about once we get serious about mentioning. It probably matters how we construct homogeneity. That matters a lot too. But I might warn us against pushing too quickly toward homogeneous districts centered on communities of interest. And what we might lose in doing so is ensuring that voters are exposed to challenging arguments and viewpoints, what Sam described earlier today in a phrase that I like, as the greater richness of political speech in the democratic experience, right? So that's one thing we might care about. It's a central part of democracy, and it might be important for us to consider in redistricting as well. Okay, thanks.
Okay, we have some time for questions and discussion. Let me ask first if any of our speakers want to respond to anything that anybody else has said. If not, then the mics are open, and let me encourage questions.
So I have a couple of loosely related questions. First, for John, I found this data about the disparities in voting power fascinating, and I want you to go beyond what your data say to speculate about what you think may be causing these disparities in voting power, why African Americans, people of low income, some women are getting less bang for their voting buck. Second, this relates to the discussions of Ohio and California. Boy, you know, if you were looking, I've been sort of, to some extent, involved in the debates over redistricting here. And if you were looking for a poster child for partisan gerrymandering, you'd be hard-pressed to do better than Ohio both in the last cycle and this one. I mean, put it in the simplest terms, we're more or less a 50-50 state, and yet 3/4 of our congressional seats are likely to be Republican seats. I have a couple of former students of whom I'm very proud who are in the room today and have been in the midst of these. Sarah Cherry, who's counsel to the Ohio House Democrats, and Representative Kathleen Clyde. So, you know, I'm part of a group right now that's actually working on drafting something that's partially modeled on California that, you know, if there's enough money to gather signatures, we'd like to try to put on the ballot in 2012. That's a big if. You know, we're literally in the process of writing this thing right now. Basing it on the competition, partly on California, partly on the competition criteria that Mark, you alluded to, focusing on compactness, competitiveness, representational fairness, and maintenance of county municipal boundaries. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of that, whether that kind of process modeled loosely on California makes sense here and in other states. I'm particularly interested in communities of interest as a factor and whether that's something that should be concluded. I gather from the presentation that I heard from Karen McDonald, who was the staff person for the California Commission, that was a bit of a headache, but worthwhile in terms of getting public participation and getting people involved in the process and talking about what really is and isn't a community of interest.
I guess I'll go first. In terms of the origins of differential group voting power, I mean, I guess I sort of put my cards on the table about how I measured it. I guess I'm grateful for the opportunity to think about and talk about how, what reforms might be introduced to equalize group voting power. I mean, if I measure group voting power based on turnout and sort of vote propensity and group size, some of those things are more amenable to governmental institutions than others, and for turnout for the vote propensity between the parties, I think maybe nothing less than doing away with single-member districts would actually be necessary to actually make that happen. You'd have to move to a proportional system because the capture of the groups is really a function of the fact that we only have two parties. The fact that we have two parties is a function of the fact that we have a single-member district system. So,
I see. So the two-party system is the real underlying cause
for that segment of differential voting power, in my view, yes. Yeah. So, any efforts either through governmental or private sector initiatives to increase turnout across all groups would also equalize group voting power more than it currently is. And group size is a harder one to imagine how that might change. Obviously, through districting, you can change the differential size of groups, but overall, in the country as a whole, you sort of have to work with the fact that some of these groups only make up 12 or 13% of the population. So, in the end, why do the groups get differential sort of bang for their voting buck? It's because they have different voting power, I think. That's my argument, essentially.
I guess I'm trying to get at
why.
The why question. I think you partly gave the answer, which is districts.
Yes, that would be part of it. I mean, I think majority and minority districts might also play a role in this with respect to African Americans and Latinos, but I have to think through how that might be. But maybe the culprit is single-member districts. And as long as you have politicians who want to be reelected and they look at the voting population and those citizens contribute differentially to their ability to get reelected, then you can't get away from this.
Citizens commissions and communities of interest.
I'll talk about communities of interest real quick. And Justin has written as much or more on homogeneous districts than I have.
Thank you.
So yeah.
Nobody reads it, but
communities of interest is really slippery, and I mean, I've got some great war stories from Texas. Last time I was on the stand, and one of the competing plans was he was trying to, the lawyer was basically trying to tell the judge how great his communities of interest were through me, saying, "No, look, we've made the districts in West Texas look like they did in the 1950s," and like he thought this was a good idea. I'm like, why? Why? And so he thought that somehow mimicking districts from 50 years ago would be a good thing, and this was a community of interest. And largely, we think of communities of interest as geographic, and I think that's the huge mistake we always make, because communities of interest are ideological. And to the extent that ideology and geography overlap, well, then we could talk about geography, but they don't always, and they don't a lot. So, is Dallas County a community of interest? Well, when the federal government is sending us, whatever pork, when it's distributive politics, that's when geographic communities are real communities. But on real important issues, ideological issues, they're not. And so that's why I think taking the line seriously is probably a mistake. So.
As far as citizens commissions in California, a couple of years ago, the California Journal of Politics and Policy asked me and another guy named Matt Jarvis to write some articles on redistricting in California and the question of whether or not instituting something like the Citizens Commission and trying to get more competitive districts would solve some of the issues that California has, because California has some really interesting governmental procedures, including some strange supermajority requirements in the state legislature. What was that?
The kind way of putting it.
Yes. And so Matt Jarvis and I wrote these dueling articles on whether or not redistricting reform would do anything. And Matt Jarvis took the position that we should have a redistricting system, something like the Citizens Commission, that would create more competitive districts with the hope that that would actually create bias. Now, this is an important recognition that a lot of people miss, which is that more competitive districts, you get less proportionate results in the end. But his objective was to create something that would create a Democratic supermajority to get over the supermajority requirements that make California politics a mess. I took the position that that probably wouldn't work. So then just recently, in the last couple of months, we have the new redistricting plan. So the Journal asked me and Matt Jarvis to revisit those articles. And essentially what happened was the California plan was produced by a Citizens Commission, but it actually looked like a Democratic scheme. It is a plan with a significant Democratic bias. But the interesting thing about it is, despite the fact that there is a bias there, it is a bias that is probably not big enough to create the Democratic supermajority necessary to deal with the legislative requirements. So the end result is a system in which you have disproportionate representation in the state legislature, but not sufficiently disproportionate representation to deal with legislative procedure, which in a sense is the worst of all worlds. And this is what a Citizens Commission produced. So when I wrote my second article for this, I started it in sort of a snarky way, saying, hooray, everything is solved. The great and glorious Citizens Commission has produced a plan, and a new golden era will begin. And then proceeded to say, no, that's not what's going to happen. So in essence, you have that Citizens Commission, which produced a plan which is arguably the worst of all possible worlds.
I take a different view of that, but I don't want to get into an argument with you.
So on competition versus communities of interest,
Yeah.
because we might think that
Yeah.
there's
some
a tension between those two. So I think with the reform experience over the last 10 years, what that tells us is that it's easier to sell the communities of interest story than competition. And I think that has to do with just interest group politics. So I think the various kind of group leadership, and it's really elite mobilization that matters here. It's not the average guy on the street that's really outraged and becoming an activist. And so they can organize around that. They know that that type of approach is going to carve out, representation for them, and they can argue for that. And there's something appealing about that, about letting the process decide that, which groups really matter, and letting them fight that out, rather than designing that from afar with the sort of hope of objectivity. So to the degree that we think we're creating a neutral process and we have concerns about whether anything could be neutral, there's something nice about having it centered around this kind of interest group bargaining and a political process that occurs before these commissions, rather than by some sort of purportedly objective design. And competition's harder to sell, in part because it's scary to these groups. They have no guarantee in a process like that. And there's no one really fighting as effectively for the median voter, because that's really who wins out with the competition approaches.
Other than Sam.
Yeah. Other than Sam, right, who has, I guess he hasn't worked hard enough, really. And so the competition approaches haven't done as well, I think, politically, even if there's a lot of normative appeal to them.
Thank you.
If I could, as a geographer, I guess I want to take a little bit of an exception to the idea that geography doesn't matter. I think, I think, communities of interest obviously do have a certain level of geography, and obviously there's an element of dispersion of communities of interest over geography, ubiquitous distributions, if you will, in some cases. But geography does still matter in a lot of ways in terms of communities of interest. I guess one of the things I have a question about, because I'm not familiar with the literature, is whether or not anybody's actually studied whether or not in non-competitive districts there actually is less dialogue about from various points of view than in competitive districts. I mean, that's sort of an assumption. I hear a lot of talk about that, but I don't know if there's anything empirically valid about it, basically.
Thank you.
Hi there. I had a former Ohio State Senator who has been involved in redistricting repeatedly come to my election law class to discuss redistricting. And one of the points that he made about this year's proposed, before the redistricting plan that was in the paper yesterday, which is after the time he came, he said that he thought that the Republicans' plan was excellent. He's a Democrat. He said that he thought that it was fine, far better than the Democrats had any reason to expect. And the points that he made about it were, first of all, that instead of just one protected minority district, there were now two. Secondly, that incumbents were forced to face off in two different places, but one pair were Republicans and one pair were Democrats. And he said, on the whole, this is pretty good and pretty fair. And he thought that this was a better map than they had, as I said, any right to expect. So I'm wondering what you think about that. And then the other question, didn't seem like many of you addressed incumbent protection as far as different kinds of criteria. And that was one that was explicitly excluded from the California Citizens Commission. And there is a role for incumbency, of course, and particularly in political seniority. So I'm wondering, in your view, and against the other considerations for redistricting, would you want incumbent protection to be eliminated as one of the acceptable criteria?
Let me respond to your first question, Candace. I've done my own quick evaluation of how competitive the districts are according to the approved plan. And as I say, I came out with, I can't remember the numbers, 3 or something that were competitive. And that's not what you're hearing in the paper, in the media. The media talks about, what, there are 12 clearly Republican and 4 Democrat. Well, I don't know where they're drawing that line on what's Democrat, what's Republican. In terms of totals, above and below 50%, that may be true, but there's that 45 to 55% vote swing in there that you would probably call competitive. And there are some competitive districts according to that 45-55% range. If you look at at least the 2008 and the 2010 election results. So that's the first question that you asked.
I'll say a couple words about that. As far as the Ohio plan, you can make the case that the Republicans could have tried to take more advantage than they did. Based on the analysis that I was presenting, I don't really think they could have gone much further without putting their own seats significantly at risk. But there was a perception that they could have done more. And I think the argument that the plan sort of looked fair came from a fear that Republicans might try to go further than they did. I don't think that's what's happening. I think what was happening was they realized that they made very big gains in 2010 because 2010 was a good year for Republicans, and they thought that a better strategy than trying to pick up even more than that was to try to consolidate the gains that they made, which I think was essentially what was happening. Now, if your expectation is that they're going to do even more than that, then you're going to be satisfied with an attempt to consolidate their gains. As for the incumbency protection issue, Tom and I are the two people who would argue that we like incumbency protection plans. We both want very homogeneous districts, not because we like protecting incumbents, but because we think that they are more representative plans overall, and the consequence of that is protecting incumbents, and we're both fine with that. But everybody else, I think, is pretty much going to say, don't protect incumbents.
Well, I think being aware of where incumbents live when you draw is different than protecting incumbents to the extent that you and I would protect them. So that was the Democratic Commission, as I understood it. They weren't supposed to know, where the incumbent. They're supposed to draw the map, because that's the first thing you do. It's like, where's Waldo? Where are the 40 Waldos on the map? Because that's who we're drawing for. And I think that they didn't do that. So that was the distinction. So, and I'm agnostic about that. I haven't really thought about drawing it without knowing where they're living. So.
I don't see a reason to have incumbency protection as one of the priorities in an affirmative redistricting process. I mean, I don't have a problem with incumbents being reelected, but they have advantages, and they're likely to have those advantages. They have them in non-districted offices as well as districted ones, and so I don't know that we need to build that into the system.
I'm not a law student, or in fact, I'm his GA. And so I like a lot of what you guys say kind of doesn't go over my head necessarily. But just when we were talking about this before, like, I thought this was supposed to be about like one person, one vote thing, and this communities of interest thing is very interesting. But like, I live in a heavily Democratic neighborhood on the west side of Cleveland, and I've voted for Democrats before. But I sometimes feel like if I wanted to vote for a Republican, well, what's the point of me going to vote? Because my vote doesn't matter. And so when people draw districts like that, like, why don't they draw districts where I can actually listen to both sides, and I'm not going to just assume that the Democrat's going to win. So, you know, I can listen to both sides and actually make a choice. And do you think that people in general vote along party lines, and that people don't? I don't know this. You guys, like, when, like, and the law is good and everything, but it kind of seems that it complicates everything.
Yes, people do vote along party lines, and they do very little else. If you look empirically at voting behavior, you can explain something. You can explain somewhere between 80 and 90% of all votes with just party ID. So yes, people vote along party lines. As far as talking to people, so Mark and I happen to live very close to each other. We can talk to each other. If somebody were to draw a district line between us, I don't think that would stop us from talking to each other. So I'm not. Maybe it would, but I'm not sure why somebody.
Matters.
Okay, so if somebody were to split our neighborhood up, then legally I would no longer be allowed to talk to Mark, or he wouldn't want to talk to me because we'd be in competition with each other or something like that. You can talk to whoever you want. I'm not sure what drawing district lines will do. As far as political dialogue goes, the one argument you can make about district lines, and some people have, is that if you draw heterogeneous districts, you're more likely to have competitive elections, which Tom and I hate and everybody else loves. But one of the consequences of that is you have more active campaigns in those competitive districts. There is more attention to politics. This is measurable. People know more. However, you also wind up with election results that make people a lot less happy, which is the point that Tom and I both argue.
What you just said, though, go against what one of you said earlier, that if you have more competitive districts, people are less likely to participate in the political process. But you just said if there are more competitive districts, then people are more likely to participate.
Yes, and empirically, if you look at the data, places where there are competitive elections, you have higher turnout, you have more knowledge of the candidates, things like that. This is measurable, and people have been doing the analysis for a couple of years now. The results are fairly consistent on this.
So on the district line thing, so I take the point that the district line is not going to alter the likelihood that you guys talk, but where you draw the lines affects the election discourse potentially. So
yes.
So what candidates enter, what they talk about, that is affected by the district lines, and I guess that's what I'm talking about, less about the one-to-one. Right?
Yeah.
Is there data on that, or is that just assumed?
I haven't seen any direct data, quantitative data, about the political dialogue itself and the quality of the dialogue, but what is measurable, or we can measure things like turnout. Turnout is higher when districts are more competitive. I just don't care. No, just Tom. People know more about the candidates. Well, Tom and I don't care, but that's measurably true. As far as the quality of the political dialogue, I don't know how you would measure that, but it is plausible that you would have more meaningful political dialogue in those districts, whatever that means. And I'm not sure why Tom and I would care, but that might make a lot of people happy.
Well, I think his point about competitiveness was he just wanted to be the decisive voter, right? Right. And we all do, right, as it turns out.
Well, the thing is, your vote won't matter, though. The likelihood that you will be the pivotal voter in an election is so small that it is actually smaller than the likelihood that you will be hit by a bus and killed on the way to the polling place. So you don't matter.
It has to feel like that it's worthwhile to go to vote. Like whoever I'm voting for has a chance.
That chance is unrelated to whether or not you vote, but
you're whatever. A Democrat and you live in a Democratic district. It sounds like it's a good match. But you vote for Democrats?
Yeah, I vote both ways now.
Oh, okay. All right.
Okay, well, on that note, maybe we should we should call it call time on this session. I think we've had a lot of really good ideas. We will take a short break, reconvene just after 2:30. But meanwhile, thank you very much for a really stimulating program.